Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. My name is Leah Jones. I'm the Education Coordinator for Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. Thank you for joining us today. As you can see, I'm not here alone today. We actually have special guests here with us. We are joined by Kendall Crawford, our co-director here at VIPL, and a fellow with Congressman McEachin's staff, Naadiya, who Kendall will be introducing shortly. Thank you both for joining us today. And now, without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you, Kendall.
Thanks, Leah, and welcome, everyone. As Leah said, my name is Kendall Crawford. I'm the co-director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. As you know, if you've been tuning in to our conversations on Fridays, you know that our organization's mission is to collaborate as people of faith to grow healthy communities and advance climate justice through education, advocacy, and worship. Today, I am particularly excited because we have Naadiya Hutchinson with us. You're in for a treat this afternoon. Naadiya Hutchinson is a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellow working with Virginia Congressman Donald McEachin from representing the 4th District. So we're very excited to have Naadiya here with us. Welcome, Naadiya.
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, rather.
Yeah, just 1 minute ago, it was morning. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I know that we heard a few months back about the really exciting environmental justice grants opportunity that Congressman McEachin's office worked on. And I'm just really excited to learn more about you and also to hear more about this really awesome grant opportunity for EJ communities. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've come to work with Congressman McEachin, some of the things that you're working on.
Yeah, of course. And I'm just so happy to be here today sharing these opportunities. So as you introduced so well, my name is Naadiya Hutchinson, and I'm a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellow. And I actually got my master's from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in environmental health. And my whole background was really focused on environmental justice and specifically cumulative impacts. And just a bit of a background for those that don't know what cumulative impacts are. Cumulative impacts is a different way of assessing pollution in our communities. And so usually when we think of pollution, it's usually one source and maybe 1 or 2 health impacts, but instead we layer everything together. So we're looking at multiple sources of pollution at the same time and how they might lead and kind of work together to cause even more severe health impacts. And so that's really where my background is and where a lot of my passion lies. And Congressmember McEachin actually has been a champion for cumulative impacts both on state level policy, but also federal policy, specifically the Environmental Justice for All Act. And so when I joined as a CBCF fellow, they were really trying to connect me with someone that had similar interests. And it just so happened that I ended up in McEachin's office. And it's been a great experience from there. And I've been really excited to work with Congressmember McEachin and so many other great EJ partners these past few months. Especially with the new momentum around environmental justice that the current administration has.
Awesome. I know that there's been an effort among environmental justice advocates here in Virginia to, also kind of raise up the importance of cumulative impacts. Would you mind just saying a little bit more about why it's so important that we're thinking and talking about cumulative impacts in particular?
Yeah, of course. And so cumulative impacts is something that, in my opinion, seems like it should have been happening from the beginning. And probably that's how many EJ communities feel too. And so currently the way that the system is set up, if industry, so let's say they're an industrial facility that's going to be putting chemicals in the water. They only need to kind of work in their specific zone. So that would be the Clean Water Act. And as long as they're not breaking any Clean Water Act rules, they're completely fine. But when we look at cumulative impacts and we think about things from a cumulative impacts assessment, what other facilities are already in the neighborhood that they're in? So maybe this industry or facility that's polluting the water also would be joining in with other facilities that are already polluting the water or that are already polluting the air. And our bodies don't have the capacity to kind of pick and choose what things that we're going to respond to. And so that can lead to cumulative health impacts. So then we're looking at more severe health outcomes such as cancers, very much so asthma, cardiovascular disease, even diabetes can be affected by some of these multiple types of pollution that are hitting us from various different ways. And historically speaking, and in history lives in this present moment, a lot of these communities that have the most density of polluting facilities, and sometimes even the most severity of the chemicals that they're being exposed to, are our low-income communities, are communities of color, Black communities, Hispanic communities. And so it's also not just affecting everyone, but it's already affecting communities that already suffer so much more. And so when we look at how do we respond, we're really looking at it from a justice perspective of who is being impacted the most severely, and how can we make sure that these communities don't bear this undue burden of pollution.
Wow. So it sounds like our bodies are taking in these multiple sources of pollution, but our policies aren't.
Yeah, exactly.
Taking them into account.
Exactly.
Thank you for that explanation. Can you talk about how the environmental justice grants fit in with Congressman McEachin's environmental priorities?
Yeah, so Congressmember McEachin is an advocate for all things environment, and also all things equity based. And so he's really kind of merged those two together and really fallen into this deep passion with environmental justice. And so environmental justice at large involves our cumulative impacts, but also once we've had this understanding of communities having this disproportionate burden of pollution, something has to be done. And for the most part, that involves money. That involves money to assess what is happening in our communities. That involves money to clean up some of these issues and some of these kind of undue or unkept areas that have continuously been polluted, like some of our Superfund sites that are in the district. And so when we look at our priorities, we recognize that environmental justice and environment at large are interconnected. And so Congressmember McEachin has actually really put environmental justice at the forefront of his environmental campaigns, because there is this understanding that everything is interconnected, especially with the environment and with health.
Wow. Thank you. I know a lot of folks, well, I don't know. I work at VAIPL, so we talk about the connection between environment and health a lot, but it is kind of something that's easy to slip your mind if you don't necessarily live and work in this world of environmental justice advocacy. Could you tell us a little bit about how these grants will help communities?
Yeah, so the environmental justice grants actually serve as an opportunity for communities to mobilize around some of these environmental justice issues. And so previous programs have done anything from researching, especially in Virginia, actually around water quality, but then also around capacity building. And so this can be putting together a youth program that focuses on equipping youth with knowledge around environmental issues, or this could be partnering with the state government or the local government to actually do infrastructure improvements. And so I kind of uplift a program that was done in 2020 that actually kind of worked together with a variety of departments called the Southeast Rural Community Assistance Project, was the kind of recipient of the grant. And they were focused on Virginia's Eastern Shore. And they were doing a lot of water quality improvement projects And this was really interesting because it actually focused the most on low-income populations. The Eastern Shore is kind of your tourist attraction, but there's also a lot of low-income people that live on the Eastern Shore. And a lot of people have septic systems, and when septic systems leak, they can actually affect and get into your drinking water supply. And so then you're drinking your poop, honestly, and that's not anything that anyone wants, and also can lead to a lot of really severe infections. And so this project worked to clean up some of these septic system issues, but also just address and have a better understanding of the data, because sometimes we don't know. There is a lot of data that's being collected already by the federal government, but sometimes we need a little extra support, a little extra emphasis. Community members know their communities best. And so sometimes it also acts as an opportunity for community members to really get the data to support some of the long-term hesitations or just long-term things that they might have been questioning. And so there's a wide variety of things that people can do with these environmental justice grants. But in 2021, we're still kind of recovering and honestly not even completely over the COVID-19 pandemic. The EPA is really also focused on COVID-19 and how the environment is interconnected with COVID-19. And so I kind of call upon this Harvard study that happened earlier in 2020. And the Harvard study actually saw that communities that had more air pollution also had and were more likely to have community members that were dying due to COVID-19. And so that showed this direct connect between the environment and people's health outcomes. And so I think that when we look at EJ grants and what type of opportunities there are for what to do with this money, there is almost like you can do anything as long as you're really connecting it back to the health of the community, and in particular to the health of those that are most at need. And so another thing that this Harvard study looked at was it wasn't even just that communities that had air pollution were dying, but it also seemed really disproportionate. And so it was low-income communities, it was Black communities that had this increased chance of being in an area with more air pollution. And so we really want to decrease some of these disparities, and this grant serves as an opportunity to do so.
How much money in total is there for these grants?
So, and that's a great question. It really depends on the grant itself. And so right now there's 2 different grants that are kind of circulating, and they both close on June 1st. And so one of the grants is specifically just for environmental justice small grants, and I think that that's up to $500,000. But there is a link that is in the head bar thing right now that people can click on and kind of get the full specs on it. And then there's also the collaborative grant. And so the collaborative grant is actually what the Rural Water Association that I mentioned previously got. And those grants tend to be a little bit larger. And it's really because those grants tend to focus on collaborations between nonprofits, community organizations, state organizations, local entities. But if you're thinking about water issues in particular, because I know that water is a really large issue in the state of Virginia, there's actually water-specific grants. And so the water-specific grants also can be found on the EPA website. Their dates, I think, are a little bit different, and some of them actually haven't been opened up yet. So if you're thinking about a water program, now is probably the time to start writing the grant, because a lot of these grants can be very time-intensive, pretty tedious. They require a lot of information. A lot of this information can be found on EPA websites. So some tools are the environmental justice or the EJ screen. So the environmental justice screen. There's also just some other like toxic inventory assessments that are up on the EPA website that people can use when putting together and trying to find data on the grant programs or for the grant programs. And so it really depends on what you're trying to get out of the grant. I would say that a lot of the water infrastructure issues tend to require more money than $500,000. And so those types of grant programs, I do think, tend to lead themselves to doing some of these larger proposals. And so starting as soon as possible in the application process is really helpful. But I would say that any amount of money can be really helpful in at least getting things started. And so if you know in the long term that you want to apply for maybe a larger drinking water grant, but you need some startup funds to get the data that you need to then do the larger project, the EJ Small Grant might be a great opportunity too.
So June 1st, did you hear that, folks out there? June 1st, that deadline is right around the corner.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was also just going to add that June 1st is right around the corner, but there are other, and I'm hopeful that this will be a grant that's reoccurring every year. So if you don't meet the deadline for this year, I think there will be opportunities. And there is going to be, and hopefully there will be more money that's going into environmental justice in the coming years. The Biden administration has made it one of their kind of like top priorities is environmental justice, and specifically the Justice 40 initiative, which says that 40% of all benefits will go to environmental justice communities. And that's going to be a really great influx of money. And so I think that there will continue to be these environmental justice small grant programs. So don't get too discouraged if you don't make it by the June 1st deadline. And if you just saw the Justice 40 Accelerator link, that's actually a program that's available, and it's run by a nonprofit organization. And it's really to equip people with the materials to fill out some of these grant applications, because federal grant applications can be quite time intensive and pretty technical if you haven't previously done it.
Wow. Okay, so other than the deadline, which is June 1st, do you have any tips for communities that want to apply? What do communities need to know to apply for these grants?
Always bring it back to either the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. When we're looking at these grants, we really want to make sure that there's a clear analysis and connection between the environment and health, because there is a lot of laws in place right now through the Clean Water Act and through the Clean Air Act to protect Americans' health. And so if you're thinking of doing a water project, bring it back to the Clean Water Act. So talk about how clean water is a right of all Americans. If you're thinking of doing something around maybe farming or agriculture, maybe you're interested in having a farmer's market or a youth education program that's geared towards connecting youth with farming and gardening. Maybe you're going to try and connect it back to either the Clean Air Act, because the Clean Air Act is really all about air improvements. And it's been really proven that the more green spaces we have, the more access to outdoor space we have, the better our air is going to be. Maybe you're trying to do an advocacy campaign around getting people to bike or getting people to walk, or maybe you want to install a new bike lane and you need money for that. Bring it back to the Clean Air Act and improvements to air quality. So there's all these opportunities, and I think you just have to really critically think about how can this grant fall into the larger landscape of protecting water and air, because that's what the EPA is really, really focused on, and that's going to make your grant kind of stand out. I will be so honest that these grants are extremely competitive. Environmental justice is an issue all across the nation. And so there's a lot of people kind of like trying to apply for what's actually kind of a small pot of money. And so I would say that if you don't get the grant, you've done all the background work to then apply and use this information that you've gathered for other grants too. And so I also encourage people to not feel like it's all for nothing if you do not receive the grant, but rather that it's an opportunity to increase your knowledge base, increase the understanding that you have of the topic, which will make you more competitive for maybe state, local, or foundation grants.
So it seems like this is really an opportunity for communities to be creative, to do some joint brainstorming to figure out what projects will benefit a specific community, and then to try for funding. But don't be discouraged if you don't get it, because you would have already put in all the groundwork. So you can still use all of that material for opportunities down the road. It's very cool. Very cool. So what other support is out there for environmental justice communities? I know we're just kind of talking about this being a very competitive process.
Yeah, and so the Justice 40 Accelerator, I think, is going to be an invaluable resource because it is kind of directly connecting people with the technical assistance that is needed to get through some of these grants, and hopefully to also connect people to other grants. I would also say that some of your state level governments, local governments also might be really invaluable resources, at least for starting to build connections. I think that there's a lot of state and local programs around environmental health that are out there that maybe don't have as much community input as you would think. So a good example of that is Virginia State actually has a cooling assistance program right now where they will help families pay for air conditioning, or they will help families pay for their air conditioning bill during the summer. And so sometimes just having a better understanding of what programs are already available, which usually happens through building these connections with state and local governments, because there are actually a lot of resources out there. But I think that sometimes in the ever expansive internet, it's really easy for some of these resources to get lost. And then I would also say that building community consensus and community energy around maybe just 1 to 2 top priorities, and then advocating with those priorities with people like Congressman McEachin, but also other state and local governments, because Congress members and any government official has so many issues that they're kind of engaging with on the day-to-day. But there's really a lot of power in numbers. And so if you can build coalitions, so maybe there's multiple organizations that all have maybe 1 to 2 top priorities, and working together with those coalitions or building those coalitions up to elevate your top priorities to these government officials. Because also the federal government isn't the end all be all of sorts. Like, there are a lot of amazing opportunities that the federal government is trying to put out there, but it usually falls on the state and local government to kind of act out these programs. And so I think that building some of these relationships to really make sure that you're advocating for your community's needs. I know that Congressmember McEachin is really interested in always looking to empower community members. And I think that that means not having your voice said by other people. So really making sure that it's a grassroots effort that is spreading the word, both internally among community networks, but also that it's the grassroots organizers that are bringing their message to some of these officials.
Right. So although we're kind of towards the back end of our conversation this afternoon, I realized I didn't necessarily ask you for a definition of environmental justice communities. So if you could just maybe say a little bit about what is an environmental justice community before we close everything out.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the question that's on everyone's mind. I'm not sure if you saw me do the big sigh when you asked it, because I think that that's something that everyone's trying to figure out. And so from my background as someone that did a lot of science research, I see environmental justice communities as communities that disproportionately bear the brunt of pollution. And I also see it as communities that already have disproportionate health impacts already in place. And so in Virginia, I'd say that Richmond is and has some of the largest environmental justice neighborhoods in it. So that means that there's a high amount of people of color, There's a lot of, or not a lot, but there is a significant amount of low income individuals in the neighborhood or in the city. And then you compound that with the fact that there is multiple industrial facilities. And I also would say that if a community feels as if they're an environmental justice community, if you see people that are really struggling health-wise, and you can't really understand why, but you've seen this facility in your neighborhood for a while, I would question maybe any of the data that you see on these federal websites. The federal government is doing a lot to collect data, but there is a lot of holes that need to be filled. And so I would say that sometimes environmental justice goes beyond just the data that is available on some of these federal websites to, more importantly, the impacts that are felt in our communities. And so I think the cumulative impacts is really a step in the right direction of defining what an environmental justice community is. But I would say that hallmarks of environmental justice communities tend to be multiple facilities or multiple sources of pollution in a community, kind of merging with the fact that that community already has other disproportionate or historical marginalization.
Thank you. Thank you for that definition. And I guess in closing, it would be good to kind of get your take on what are the next steps that you see as being important to really move forward environmental justice.
Okay, so Congressmember McEachin is currently spearheading and is actually, it's already up now, is the Environmental Justice for All Act. And so that's a federal policy that actually institutionalizes cumulative impacts as the way that the government really does an assessment of permitting. And so I think that being a champion for the Environmental Justice for All Act, mobilizing your communities around it is a really great first step. But then I also think it requires an understanding of what state and local allies that you have also in government level positions. So what state bills, what local bills are also pioneering cumulative impacts. I know that in New Jersey, they actually just had a cumulative impacts bill go through the government. And so kind of having an eye for what other bills are going through on cumulative impacts and trying to mirror those and advocate for those where you live. I'd also say that next steps sometimes include conversations and building relationships, both with state, local, and federal governments, as I've said, but also with community members and seeing where people are at, where's people's energy at in terms of what they have the time and capacity to organize around, but also who's in the most need. And so we've seen such a great mobilization around COVID-19, such an increase in organizations such as mutual aid and community groups that have really focused on trying to make sure that those that are at the most need are having their needs met. And how can we continue that? How can we continue to build these relationships? And how can we make sure that the next crisis isn't the same as this one? So we saw, and it really comes at such a heavy heart, that there was so many deaths within the Black community, disproportionately due to COVID-19. And so how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again? Our communities can't face any more losses. And I think that that really comes with building relationships to kind of build stepping stones around and support systems around making sure that we have these community protections. And environmental justice is just one part of the larger puzzle for that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Naadiya. It really has been a pleasure to chat with you to learn some more about these environmental justice grant opportunities. And again, just thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And I guess goodbye to everyone out there.